So the message today is it's the kind of message where I wish all my kids were here. It's also the kind of message where I'd be happy for my parents not to be here. You'll know what I mean in just a moment. Thanks for coming out today. We are continuing in our series, a fresh look at the first 10. Last week we talked about the first 4 of God's commandments, and today we're going to look at commandment number 5, which, spoiler alert, is, some of you might have already guessed, honor your father and your mother. We're going to talk about parents. We're going to talk about family, the importance of such things. You know, it's interesting. As a parent, I can kind of testify to the reality that there's a moment in the lives of your kids where you're like kind of doing everything to see them, you know, do the next awesome thing, right? I mean, when they're little babies, we're doing everything we can to get them to walk, right? To take those first steps. And then, you know, as they start stumbling across and maybe kind of holding themselves up on the furniture, and then eventually, you know, taking the real first step, you know, to mommy or daddy. We're so excited, right? I mean, it's such a beautiful thing. Some of us have recorded it on video. We get to play it back. Some of us just have to kind of remember what that must have been like. And then a little later on, we're trying to get them to, you know, maybe say those first words, right? Mommy, daddy, that kind of thing, and doing everything we can to try to get them to talk. And isn't it cute just how, you know, they start saying those first words, right? Start, you know, putting into language the things that they had been unable to express before, right? And then shortly after that, we do everything we can for the rest of their lives to get them to sit down and be quiet, right? Like, isn't that just kind of the summary of what it means to be a parent? You know, I was wondering, especially as I look around the room here, lots of people probably that could offer a variety of opinions for, you know, what it would take for us to see our society become a better place in which we could live. If we were to start kind of taking a poll, what are the problems that we are currently experiencing in our society? What are some of the difficulties? What are some of the challenges? And I imagine, you know, we'd be able to offer a variety of ideas for what ails us, a variety of solutions for what might make things better. And I want to suggest what I probably would imagine might be the one defining characteristic that would actually help us with so many of the problems that we have, and that is that if our families became stronger than they are, I imagine our society would become stronger than it already is. Like I said, we are looking at this 5th commandment, and I'd like to read for you where we get these commandments from, the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 2, and then going on into the first 4, and then ultimately the 5th one. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn to Exodus chapter 20. We'll start reading verse 1. It says, "Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery." And then God begins to declare what are the foundational commandments of this covenant that he was establishing with this people that he had rescued from slavery in Egypt, right? This people that he had displaced from a life of bondage and servitude and hopelessness, and this people that God was calling to himself. He was establishing a covenant with them, and in doing that, sets up the framework for how that covenant is going to be lived out, right? Here's the first commandment. He says, "Do not have other gods besides me." We talked about what it means for God to be at the center of our lives. He goes on to say, "Do not make an idol for yourself," right? And then the third command, "Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God." The fourth command, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." And then our commandment for today, "Honor your father and your mother so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you." I want to talk a little bit about what exactly is happening here as these commandments are being laid out. The first 4 we find are focusing primarily on our relationship with God, right? God establishing the order in which we are going to live in harmony with him, right? "Do not have any other gods besides me," he says, right? Don't make idols and worship them, right? Don't misuse the name of God. Don't treat it as something that is empty or without respect, right? And then and in the 4th commandment, although the commandment of the Sabbath certainly has implications for how we are in relationship with God. We find later on Jesus especially instructing on how the Sabbath was ultimately created for our benefit and for our purpose. But these first four really help provide some flesh and bones to what it means to live in harmony with God, right? And then the next six of the Ten Commandments are political. These are political commandments in the sense that they are going to instruct us as people on how we are going to live among other people, right? God wasn't issuing these commandments to a singular person living in isolation and apart from society. No, each individual was going to live alongside and among an entire nation of people, right? And in doing that, there are certain orders that must be followed in order for the political life of individuals to go well, right? How will this people be governed? How will people who from time to time have competing interests remain in harmony? Don't we understand that as we live in society with one another, every once in a while, the interests that you have as a person, maybe the interests that you have as a family, they actually come into conflict with the interests of another person or another family, right? So how are we ultimately going to live in harmony with one another, given the fact that we are, first of all, broken people, right? We are people that are subject to living in ways that are not right, that are not healthy. But how are we going to live in harmony within society? And so what God does here is he first, again, as he's transitioning from the experience that we have with him and our relationship with him, he begins this statement of political statements with a commandment regarding the basic unit of the society in which he is instructing, right? And what is that basic unit? Well, it's the basic unit of the family. The first commandment here, honor your father and mother, it corresponds to the first commandment we find recorded in the Bible. What is that commandment? The first commandment that we find recorded in the Bible is the commandment that God gave to Adam and Eve when he said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, right? That God provided from the beginning the framework for family. That society was ultimately going to be comprised of any number of units of family members, right? So God begins here. He recognizes that as the family goes, so goes society. So let me first direct my attention to what is an important aspect for how the family is going to be governed and lived out. Now, this commandment, honor your father and mother, as you begin to understand it, it envisioned some kind of continuity of God's covenant. When God said, honor your father and mother, the reason why he said that was because the covenant that he was establishing with his people was not something that was going to endure for a relatively short amount of time. No, God was in it for the long haul, right? As God considered bringing this people under his provision and his protection, God was in essence saying, listen, we're going to be doing this for a long time together, right? And in order for this covenant to have continuity from generation to generation, each generation must honor the generation that preceded it. Honor your father and your mother. There is certainly within the context of this command, this understanding that parents were commissioned with the sacred duty of passing on to their children, passing on to the next generation, the most important things. Now, those of you who are parents here, you understand this, right? That part of what it means to be a mom or dad, part of what it means to be a person who is invested in the next generation, whether as a biological parent, as an adopted parent, as a foster parent, as an aunt or an uncle, as a grandparent, right? As a person that is mentoring those who are following behind you, We have a duty of passing on the most important things. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, we hear this described in this way. This is God speaking to his people. Listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Now, many of us would recognize this is not listed in the Ten Commandments, but this is essentially a summary of all of the commandments of God wrapped up into one thing, right? Jesus was asked at one time, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, well, what do you think it is, right? And the person responded, well, it's to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And Jesus said that is correct, right? This is the way in which we live for God, by loving him with all that we have. He goes on to say, these words, right, that is the law that I am prescribing for you under which to live, these words that I am giving you today are to be in your heart, right? So there is this mandate given to each of us as individuals to take the commands of God and consider them not for the legislation that they are. We are to take the commands of God not for if I don't follow the rules, then I'm going to suffer bad or negative consequences. No, what we're told to do is to take the laws of God into our hearts, to make them a part of us, to weave them into the very fabric of our being, to come to this place where the laws of God are not something that become a burden for us to try to carry around. They're not rules that are trying to suppress the potential for all the fun and enjoyment that we have in life. But no, they are to give us life. They're something for which when we begin to really understand and appreciate them, they will be something we come to adore, right? Get them into your heart. And then after, and only after, we come to the place where the law of God has been incorporated into the heart and being of our own individual lives, here's what we're instructed to do with it. Repeat them to your children. Repeat them to your children. How many of you know that you have to repeat things to your children? And repeating them once is usually not enough. Am I right? Well, isn't it incredible for the sponges that they are, right? And we all know little children, as they are growing up, it is utterly amazing, their capacity to acquire knowledge. It is amazing the way in which they experience the world around them. You'll find that if you're paying attention, children will confound you with the way in which they are growing in the world. And yet, as much as they may have the capacity to learn at a pace that you and I only wish we still had, there are certain things that need to be repeated again and again and again and again. Repeat them to your children. Well, how do I do that? Well, let me illustrate for you. Talk about them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. I wonder how many of us would feel a little ashamed for how little we have not only understood, but taken to heart and lived out this commandment for us as parents, as people investing into the next generation, what it means to repeat the most important things, the sacred things to our children. To talk about them when we sit in our house, when we walk along the road, when we lie down, and when we get up. He goes on, bind them, right? These things that I have commanded you, these things that are to be instructive and core to your life, bind them as a sign on your hand and let them be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your city gates. What is he saying? He's ultimately saying, listen, not only are children forgetful, but you're forgetful. right? And so we have to keep the Word of God in front of us. We ourselves need to be reminded of what the Word of God speaks to us. And we need to allow for it to remain on the forefront, out where it is obvious, out where it's apparent for those who are following behind us. You know, life, I think we'd all understand, especially in comparison to life as it was experienced by those who were the first audience for these commands. Life has become very complex. And we have become, as parents, as people that are investing in the next generation, we've become more like general contractors who use subcontractors for specialized training of our children. Isn't that right? But while that may be true, we have to understand that as parents, we are the primary educators of our children. It is my responsibility as a father to be an educator of my children. That doesn't mean that I am going to become the primary information giver to my children of all of the things that they will experience as they're growing up, right? I mean, most of us send our kids to school. And so for hours of the day, 5 days a week, our children sit under the instruction of other adults who educate our children, especially in certain subjects that you and I as parents perhaps are not experts in. How many of you remember the day when your son or your daughter came home with some math homework that you could no longer help them with? That's a remarkable day, isn't it? Right? When you have to say to your child as they're come to you, Mom, Dad, I need some help with this, right? And you look at it and you're wondering how to phone a friend, right? Or use some other lifeline that might be available. Like, I'm sorry, I can't help you with this. We leverage the expertise in coaches as our kids are growing in sports. Unless you have, some particular special talent in some particular sport. For most of us, the experiences, our children come under the direction of others who will mentor them in growing physically and more in skill for this particular sport that they're competing in. We might put our kids in front of a teacher who will teach them how to play an instrument, right? Because we are unable to do that. Some of us have offloaded much of our spiritual education of our children into the context of a church. Like, there's a degree to which those of you who have brought children here are hoping, are expecting that when your children are in the care of other adults, that they are being instructed in the ways of God. And we have even at times, because we just don't know what else to do, we have used the television set as a babysitter when we just need a little time to ourselves, right? So we understand as parents the reality that while we may not do everything in the way in which our children are instructed, we are the primary educators of our children. We are still ultimately responsible for that. We have to be responsible for what our kids are learning in school and invested in how our children are living or learning at school. We have to be invested in how our children are developing in certain skills, whether it's in athletics or music or art or both, right? There was this understanding for those who were listening that this commandment related to what was a vital means of passing the covenant of God's blessing from one generation to another. What was similar between the world in which we live and the world in which the nation of Israel lived was that parents lived in a world full of corruption. They were given the responsibility of setting an example for their children, specifically teaching their children what it meant to live for God. The best gift that parents could give to their children was the priority of serving God and making him the center of their lives, of ultimately themselves living out and fulfilling that first commandment, right? To have no other gods besides God, to love God with all their heart and soul and strength. Let's talk about what it means to honor our parents. Well, to honor someone is to consider their importance. When God says, honor your father and mother, the word here used is a word that we see elsewhere translated and understood as the word that we use for glory. When we talk about the glory of God or the glory of an individual, we're talking about something that has weight and importance, something that is heavy or significant. To honor our father and mother means to ascribe to them the weight and importance that they deserve. The fact that they are, in their own right, an impressive being. If we find ourselves in a court of law having to address a judge, we address the judge as your honor, right? Now we address the judge as your honor without any respect as to his or her personality, how easily that person is to get along with, right? We have no context for understanding, how good that judge may or may not be. And yet we still ascribe honor for the position that that person holds, right? And so there's a sense in which to honor a person is to consider their importance. Honor, furthermore, is about more than mere obedience. We hear honor your father and mother, and we immediately jump to the idea that what we are instructed to do is obey our father and mother. That certainly has some relevance, but honor is about more than mere obedience. In fact, I think the primary audience to whom this commandment was spoken was probably adults. The primary significance for fulfilling this command has to do with grown men and women with regard to their relationship with their parents. Now, to honor someone may certainly mean to obey. The commandment is used centuries later by the Apostle Paul as he is instructing within the context of a church, when he is instructing particularly how families are to function in their relationships with one another. He does give us the imperative command, children, obey your parents in the Lord, right? That is the directive that he has given. Elsewhere, he says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. And this commandment for children to be obedient to their parents is founded on the commandment to honor our father and mother. But this is more. This is more than, about children or minors. And it's more than being something that's simply about compliance. As I said, I think it pertains to adult children who themselves have their own children. And it applies to imperfect parents who you might, in certain cases, actually have to disobey. To honor our parents is about more than mere obedience. But to honor our parents was understood as foundational to wholesome society. The spirit of what this law is instructing us to do is to show a level of respect and honor and weight and importance and significance to the generation before, specifically in the context of family, for our parents, because that was going to be foundational to what it meant for a society itself to be wholesome and healthy. It's interesting that today we have actually seen this turned upside down, where in ancient times society would side with the parents if there was some particular conflict within the family. Today we see that turn completely upside down, where now it is children who are given expressively individual rights, even at times over and above the desires of their parents. We might ask ourselves, is that a good thing? Is that a good thing that we have come to this place where the wishes of parents regarding their minor children have, in many cases, been disregarded, so that a child who certainly lacks the same level of wisdom and experience, and at times perhaps doesn't even know what is best for himself or herself, that they are given expressively the rights as individuals that, as far as their age and experience are concerned, they may not be ready for. The vision here seems to convey the idea that although there are certainly exceptions to the rule, right? Because not every parent is a good parent. Not every mom and dad is a good mom or dad. But that the general tenor of society should be such that there is an honoring for parents. That there is an understanding of the priority of the family structure, and that is going to ultimately contribute to the best kind of society. The breakdown of family is given to us as one indication of when we will, as human beings, encounter difficult times in society. Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 3, "But know this, hard times will come in the last days. For people will be," and he begins to describe the nature of such a society that is going to contribute to the more difficult times that we'll experience within that society. Here's how he describes it. People will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, proud, demeaning, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, without love for what is good, traitors, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. The breakdown of family contributes to the breakdown of society, and it ultimately results in more difficult times for us all. So to honor someone is to give them the weight and the importance that they deserve, and that it's more than just mere obedience. The commandment here also tells us to honor both your father and your mother. It is interesting to note that mothers are to be honored equally, which, although we might take for granted the importance of such a command, that would have been countercultural had it not been expressly delivered. The implication here could mean that we aspire to honor two individual parents, right? Every one of us, although we may not have parents who are alive or parents that we even know, biologically speaking, we all have two parents. And many of us have the experience of having both parents to some degree in our lives. And what we might aspire to do is honor both of them equally, both our mother and our father. The difficulty comes with the fact that oftentimes the interests of a mother and a father may be in conflict with one another. So how do we deal with that? Well, what we need to do is try to figure out how can we, to the best of our ability, honor, again, don't read honor as obey necessarily, but how do we ascribe the importance and significance to both our mom and our dad, even if one of those individuals happens to be the kind of person not worthy of being honored. We see kids oftentimes in a home where both mom and dad are present, try to figure out how they can leverage one parent against another, right? Some of you have experienced that, right? That's what kids will do. The kids are going to go to the parent that they think is going to give them what they want. They will try to manipulate situations in order to get their way. This can still manifest itself even in our lives as adults. You might be here this morning and your parents are separated, right? And there's a fallout that comes with that separation. And sometimes we might find ourselves in a position where we can contribute to that fallout. That we can fail to honor one, right, whose perhaps interest is in conflict with ours, that happens to side with the other parent. And so I would just tell you, if you happen to find yourself in a position where one parent is disparaging another, you don't play that game. Don't be a person that contributes to that, even if you tend to be in agreement, with how much of a knucklehead the other parent is being in some particular case. Honor both your father and your mother. Proverbs 23, verse 22 says, "Listen to your father who gave you life, and don't despise your mother when she is old." Honor your father and your mother. Next, I think we are told as we honor our parents that it may come to a place where we need to care for aging parents when they are unable to care for themselves. Right? There will, for some of us, come a time where our parents become older and unable to care for themselves. And so for us to honor them may be that we help provide care for them in the absence of their being able to care for themselves. I was thinking, it's very interesting the way in our individualistic society how we have sort of mitigated against the necessity of having the generation that follows us take care of us. How many of you are still working? How many of you are still working? So if you're still working, what are you working for? Well, you're working for today, right? You're working to take care of your present needs, but chances are you're also working with thought for how you're going to be taken care of in the future. How many of you are depending on your kids to take care of you when you get old? Right, that's right, nobody. And that's probably wise, right? That may be wise, but is it good? Is the degree, like, how much harder do you and I have to work because we have to provide for ourselves during a period of time, during a phase of life when we will not be able to provide for ourselves, right? With no expectation that our kids are going to be able to do that for us, right? We have created a kind of economy where there's no dependence on the part of parents toward their children. Now, you can argue for the merits of one way or another. All I would suggest is that we might have lost something there. What does that actually cost me? The fact that I have to work that much harder so that when I'm 70, 80, 90, 100 years old, there'll be enough resources for me and my wife to be taken care of without being a burden on our children, right? There's an individualism there that may contribute to the breakdown of family. Now, what if my parents need more from me than I can provide, right? Some of you might be find yourself in that position right now where your parents have grown older and they're more unable to care for themselves than they were before. But you are beside yourself because you don't know how you're going to provide for all of their needs. Like what if you find yourself in a position where they just need more than you can provide? All I could say to you is do what you can. Honor your father and mother. Honor your father and mother to the best of your ability. How much should we honor our parents? Well, I think we should honor our parents more than they deserve. We should honor our parents more than they deserve. Some of you may be in a position where you'd say, well, what if I don't have parents worth honoring? Right? That can be true for some of us. We might find ourselves in a position where our parents, they're not people that anybody would consider as being worth honoring. So how much should I honor a mother or father that doesn't deserve to be honored? Now, all I'd say is honor your parents more than they deserve. What if my parents are the kind of parents that have expectations for me that I will never meet? Don't raise your hands, but how many of you have parents that just seem to criticize everything? Right? They criticize the choice of career that you made or are making. They criticize the person that you're married to. They criticize the way you raised your children. Like, how do I honor parents who, if I were honest, I'm doing everything I can to maintain as much separation from them because I just can't stand how critical they are of everything, right? We may find ourselves in a place where the relationship with our parents is really, really tenuous. There's a lot of distress there. What do I do about that? Can't I just ignore them? Honor your parents more than they deserve. You know, in here there are relationships represented between parents and children, some of which are extremely healthy, some of which are extremely unhealthy, right? The reality is, for all of us, regardless of how healthy or unhealthy our relationship is with our parents, every single one of us can improve that relationship with our parents. I might go so far as to say, if your parents are just unimaginably bad, if your parents were just unimaginably the kind of folks that do not deserve to be honored, and you're wondering to what degree should you honor them, to what degree should you love them, I might suggest what Jesus instructs us, particularly about how we are to treat our enemies, right? Your relationship with your parents might have come to the place where they feel like they're the greatest enemy of your life. What does Jesus say about our enemies? He says, love your enemies and do good to them. Remember, this is for all of us, or certainly many of us. You only have so long to honor your parents before you won't have the opportunity to honor them anymore, right? And some of you, perhaps, you already understand that, right? Because your parents are no longer around for you to honor. But for those of us whose parents still remain, we need to keep in mind that our parents will only be around so long before we won't have the opportunity to honor them anymore. And the final thing I'd say to you in regard to what does it mean to honor your parents is become a parent worthy of being honored yourself. Become a parent worthy of being honored yourself. There's a lot of different ways that we can run our families. As parents, we are given the privilege of authority over our children. And so I would encourage you to consider how you are using authority in the lives of your children. And I would encourage you, don't abuse that authority. The truth is that dominance, it might be a shortcut to compliance, right? And I imagine we have all, at some point who are parents, we have reverted to dominance in order to compel compliance. But if dominance is the main feature of how we parent our children, then it is ultimately going to prove destruction to the relationship that we have with our children. That probably does not meet the criteria of becoming a parent who is worthy of being honored. On the other hand, we also have to guard ourselves as parents against permissiveness, right? Permissiveness, it might be a shortcut to avoiding conflict. How many of you have given in to avoid conflict, right? At the grocery store, right? at church, some other place, right? Permissiveness may be a shortcut to avoiding conflict, but it'll ultimately prove destructive to the child's well-being. So in becoming a parent worthy of being honored ourselves, we can't abuse our authority, we can't be overly permissive, but instead what we need to do is we need to set the example for honor. What we need to model for our children is, in becoming a parent worthy of being honored, let's model honoring others for them. Honoring our parents, honoring our grandparents, honoring our aunts and uncles, honoring those other people. In fact, honoring all people, right? The degree to which we demonstrate honor for other people, even when we honor them more than they deserve, right? We're modeling for our children what honor looks like. Honor your parents. Honor the aged people in your life. Honor your spouse. Honor your ex, who may be a parent to your child, right? And finally, honor your Father in heaven. As we demonstrate, as we set an example for our children of what it means to honor God, to put Him first, to honor and prefer other individuals over ourselves, we ourselves will become parents worthy of being honored. As we do this, I think we start to just make some headway into healing our families, into growing stronger the bonds of family, which will ultimately contribute to a greater and stronger society. Honor your father and mother so that your life may be long in the land that the Lord your God